It was said in Hollywood that Marlon Brando was untouchable, a man who broke rules, crossed lines, and stood beyond the reach of anyone brave enough to stop him. But that story was incomplete, because there was a moment when Brando touched the wrong person. There was no shouting, no fight, just a single slap. And that slap shattered everything Brando thought he was. But what made it truly remarkable was what came after that slap. Marlon Brando's real power in Hollywood came even before his acting. He deliberately did the things people said could not be done, not merely to break rules, but to expose who had written them. For Brando, limits were for others. In his world, marriage was not sacred, loyalty was not a virtue but a choice. And choices could always change. His approach to women reflected this mindset. He did not see them as conquests. Worse, he saw them as tests. "Can I take her?" was not curiosity for him. It was a challenge. What belonged to someone else always interested Brando more. Because the real satisfaction was not simply winning, but watching someone else lose. Hollywood knew this. The studios knew. Producers whispered. But no one told Brando to stop. Because at the time, Brando was not just a star, he was a symbol of change. He was tearing down the gentlemanly codes of old Hollywood and replacing them with something raw, uncontrolled, and dangerous. And as long as the system could sell that danger, it chose to ignore it. Gary Cooper's wife entered Brando's orbit in exactly this climate. This was no coincidence. Cooper's wife was the opposite of the women Brando usually pursued. She was not flashy. She did not appear in gossip columns. She was quiet, restrained, and had no desire to draw attention. And precisely for that reason, she became a symbol to Brando, a symbol of the old world, of respect, distance, and loyalty. Brando did not see a love story in her. He saw a message to Gary Cooper, to Hollywood, and to the old order itself. If even the most sacred space in Cooper's life could be touched, then nothing was truly untouchable. This was where Brando's greatest miscalculation began. His approach was not discreet. Whispers spread quickly. Hollywood was a small place, and some rumors, especially the true ones, traveled fast. But Brando did not pull back. On the contrary, he pushed further. Because in Brando's mind, silence always meant weakness. And Gary Cooper was silent. Cooper's silence was misread by Brando. He took it for fear, for acceptance, for an old man's inability to resist a new world. But Cooper was not silent because he did not know what was happening. He was silent because he knew how and when to speak. During this time, Cooper's world slowly closed in. There was no public scandal, no tabloid headlines. But for Cooper, the issue was clear. This was not gossip. This was disrespect. And for Cooper, once respect was gone, there was very little left to discuss. Hollywood continued to label Brando's behavior as a rebellious spirit. That label opened every door for him. But no one asked the real question. Where did the line between rebellion and lawlessness truly begin? And when that line was crossed, who would pay the price? Brando believed he lived in the same world as Cooper, that the same rules applied. But this was not true. In Cooper's world, there was no shouting, no threats, no spectacle. If something needed to be done, it was done quietly. And its impact came precisely from that silence. Brando failed to understand this difference. Or perhaps he refused to. Because until that moment, no man had truly told him to stop. No one had ever made him feel that he had limits. Not until Gary Cooper made his decision. And once that decision was made, there was no turning back. That day was not a special one. No dates were circled on Hollywood calendars. Journalists were not waiting outside. No one knew a breaking point was approaching. Because in Hollywood, the greatest reckonings never happen on stage. They always take place backstage, in corridors, in quiet rooms, in silence. When Gary Cooper confronted Marlon Brando, he did not raise his voice. There was no anger in his eyes, no aggression. The only thing visible on Cooper's face was determination, the expression of a decision that had been made long before. Brando did not notice it right away, because Brando was never good at reading faces. He listened more to the echo of his own presence. There were only a few steps between them. Other people were around, but no one was paying attention. Everything looked ordinary. And that was precisely why Brando was unprepared. He expected shouting, threats, maybe an insult. But Cooper did none of those things. The slap was not fast. It was not a rushed movement. There was no explosion, no loss of control. The hand rose, found its direction, and landed. The sound was sharp, but brief. The silence that followed, however, was much longer. That slap was not the beginning of a fight. It was the final period at the end of a sentence. Brando's reaction was delayed, because this was not something that happened in his world. People did not challenge Marlon Brando. People feared him. But in that moment, someone had entered his territory for the first time. And he had done it without shouting, without a display of force, without even an explanation. Cooper did not say a single word. After the slap, he did not step back. He did not run. He did not hurry away. He stood exactly where he was. And that may have been more unsettling than the slap itself. Because there was no regret in Cooper's behavior. No hesitation. This was not a momentary mistake. It was a deliberate outcome. The expression on Brando's face was not anger. It was shock. For a moment, he did not know what to do. Striking back was a reflex he was used to. But this time, he could not raise his hand. Because there was no fight. There was a matter that had already been settled. The slap did not land on Brando's body. It landed on his identity. On the illusion of untouchability he had built. The figure everyone stepped back from, admired, and forgave. That figure cracked in a single second. The people around them did not fully understand what had happened. Some heard something, but did not turn to look. Because in Hollywood, people sometimes choose not to see. But for Brando, that moment was impossible to ignore. The slap burned itself into his memory. Cooper turned around and walked away. He did not issue a warning. He did not make a threat. Everything that needed to be said had already been said. Because in Cooper's world, some messages were never delivered with words. And Brando had received this one with absolute clarity. That day, Marlon Brando was not taught a lesson. That day, a boundary was drawn for him. And it was more real than any boundary he had ever encountered. What followed, however, would be far more striking. The first thing that changed after the slap was not Brando's face. It was the air in the room. When the air changes in Hollywood, no one announces it out loud. But everyone feels it. Eye contact becomes shorter. Conversations trail off. Laughter fades early. That was what happened around Brando. After that day, the way people looked at Marlon Brando was no longer the same. No one ostracized him. No doors were slammed in his face. Hollywood does not work that way. But doors that had once been wide open now open more slowly. Offers that once came without hesitation turned into, let's check the schedule. Brando was still a major star. But he was no longer untouchable. The difference seemed small. But in Hollywood, small differences devour careers. Brando spoke to no one immediately after the slap. Nothing leaked to the press. No backstage gossip spread. Because Gary Cooper did not talk. And Brando chose silence as well. But silence did not cover the incident. On the contrary, it made it heavier. Because people fill gaps with their imagination. And imagination is far more ruthless than truth. Brando's inner circle sensed that something had broken that day. But they could not name it. They would understand later. That slap had shattered the story Brando told himself about who he was. He was no longer the man who could do anything. He had encountered a limit for the first time. And Brando did not get along with limits. Changes began on set. Brando used to arrive late, rewrite lines, and put directors in impossible positions, because he knew he could. But after the slap, those behaviors were seen through different eyes. What had once been called Brando's style was now labeled a problem. A producer quietly said, "Talent is one thing. Character is another." That sentence is rarely spoken aloud in Hollywood. But once it is said, it spreads. Did Brando notice? Yes. Did he accept it? No. Because accepting it would have meant admitting that Cooper had been right. And for Brando, that was impossible. He had always seen himself as the man who broke rules. But that slap showed him that sometimes rules stand in front of you in human form. The hardest blow, however, was internal. From that day on, Brando never spoke a single bad word about Gary Cooper. Not in private conversations. Not at drinking tables. This silence was not born of respect. It was born of defeat. Because for the first time, Brando understood that the man standing across from him was stronger. Not physically, morally. Hollywood sensed this. A star's power is not measured only in front of the camera. It is measured by how the system reacts when something happens to him. What happened to Brando was not covered up, but it was not defended either. That was the clearest message of all. Brando no longer had absolute protection behind him. From that point on, his career did not collapse, but it began to wobble. Big roles still came, yes, but the same patience was no longer shown on every project. Directors were less tolerant, producers more cautious, and Brando felt it every single day. It is said that he told a friend, "It's not the same anymore." For an actor, that sentence is terrifying, because being the same as before is the only way to survive in Hollywood. The slap did not destroy Brando, but it isolated him. And when Brando was alone, he began to harm himself even more. Discipline vanished completely. Sets turned into battlefields. The emptiness inside him only grew larger. Gary Cooper, meanwhile, continued his life as if nothing had happened. He gave no interviews, made no statements, because when he threw that slap, he had already spoken. Hollywood's memory is long, but its tongue is short. Years later, no one openly talked about that slap, but everyone knew one thing. Marlon Brando had been truly stopped for the first time. Hollywood does not put people on trial. It does not punish anyone openly. Punishments here are silent. Phone calls come later. Invitations are forgotten. Names are mentioned less often at conference tables. After the slap, Marlon Brando faced exactly this kind of silent punishment. From the outside, everything seemed fine. Brando was still the lead, still on posters, still called a genius. But behind the scenes, the system had begun to put distance between itself and him. That distance cannot be measured, but it can be felt. And Brando felt it down to his bones. In the past, Brando's whims were tolerated. Arriving late on set, rejecting the script, changing lines at the last minute. These were all marketed as Brando's creative process. But now, those same behaviors were seen as risks. Producers began whispering, "This guy causes problems." In Hollywood, the word problem is a death sentence for an actor. This is where Brando's loneliness truly began. Once, there had been a circle around him. Actors, directors, admirers. Everyone revolved around Brando. After the slap, that circle loosened. People still smiled, but there was distance. Conversations became superficial. Real connections were gone. And when Brando was alone, he was left with the most dangerous thing of all, himself. That loneliness turned into a kind of anger, but it did not explode outward. It collapsed inward. Brando became more cynical, more careless. On set, he would sometimes sabotage the work deliberately, almost as if to say, "If you don't want me, then I won't give you what you want." Years later, a director would admit, Brando wasn't acting anymore. He was punishing the role. Hollywood does not forgive that. Brando's loss of reputation did not happen overnight. It came drop by drop. On one project, he was called difficult. On another, uncontrollable. Then unreliable. Once these words begin to follow an actor, returning is extremely difficult. Brando noticed this, but he still refused to accept it. Because acceptance would have meant admitting that the slap was the most important turning point of his life. He wanted to see it as just a moment. But for Hollywood, it was a signal. During this time, Gary Cooper's name was barely mentioned. Yet his presence was everywhere. Without saying a word, Cooper had shown Brando one simple truth. You can't do everything. That idea settled into Brando's mind, and it began to gnaw at him like a worm. His personal life collapsed just as quickly. Relationships became shallow. Trust eroded. Brando became cautious even when approaching people. Because that slap had not been just a physical blow, it was a warning. And Brando felt that warning in every facial expression he encountered. Hollywood did not erase Brando completely, but it isolated him. Because a lonely star is a controllable star. And nothing was more dangerous than an uncontrollable Brando. Years later, a producer would say, Brando still had the talent, but no one wanted to pay the price anymore. That is the heaviest punishment in Hollywood. Marlon Brando had endured many blows throughout his life. Criticism, scandals, failures. He knew how to turn all of them to his advantage. But the slap he received from Gary Cooper was different. Because this blow did not come from the side, it came from above. And in Hollywood, blows from above are never forgotten. After the incident, Brando tried to redefine himself. But the problem was this. Until then, he had built his identity by crossing other people's boundaries, by breaking rules, by erasing lines, by saying, "This is who I am." The slap told him something for the first time. This is as far as you go. He could not cross that line. As the years passed, Brando's performances became increasingly uneven. In one film, he was still mesmerizing. In another, completely disconnected. Critics tried to explain this as Brando's mood. But in reality, it was the reflection of an inner conflict. Because Brando was no longer fully free, even within his roles. There was a break inside him. That break was named Gary Cooper. Cooper haunted Brando's life like a ghost. Without appearing. Without speaking. Every time Brando pushed a boundary, every time he crossed a line, the same image resurfaced in his subconscious. A quiet room, a hard stare, and a single slap. This was why Brando gradually turned toward darker roles. More broken, more inward-looking characters. Because playing the powerful man now unsettled him. Power had become a dangerous concept. He knew that when he exercised power, he paid a price. Hollywood noticed this change as well. Brando was no longer the rebellious star. He was the problematic legend. There was respect, yes, but there was also distance. And that distance pushed Brando further inward. Gary Cooper never returned to the stage during any part of this process. Because his role had required only one scene. With that slap, he had completed it. As one of the last representatives of Hollywood's old moral code, he stepped aside for a newer, more chaotic era. But he left behind a mark Brando could never erase. In the later years of his life, Brando avoided confronting his past. He spoke openly in interviews, yes, but he almost never mentioned this incident. Because some moments, once spoken aloud, must be lived again. And Brando could not risk that. Years later, it is said he told a friend, "Some people teach you who you are." No name was mentioned, but everyone knew who he meant. Gary Cooper did not destroy Brando's life, but he changed it. And for Brando, that was harder than destruction itself. Because change cannot be controlled. That slap became a single word written into Brando's story. Limit. Many stars rise, fall, and are forgotten in Hollywood. But there are moments that can stop even a legend. Brando stopped exactly there. And that is why Marlon Brando, no matter how great he was, spent the rest of his life with the same feeling. Somewhere, once, he had been stopped.